Hello and welcome to History 17B. Hey, it's our first lecture of the Foner book, and it's week 2. And today we're going to focus on a guy by the name of Thomas A. Scott. But before we go there, kind of clue you into some of the lecture topics that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about some syllabus stuff, about some secondary documents, about some lectures. Hey, we're doing that right now. And about the quizzes. And yes, our lecture today is Thomas A. Scott, Spencerian victim. If you don't know what that means, well, stay tuned. I am your instructor, Joe Crowder. History is what it's about here at Yuba College Online. Sit back, lean forward, take some notes, and let's talk about some syllabus stuff. 17B is the class. The office hours here said to be determined. We want to cross that out and add that our office hours are going to be Wednesdays and Fridays, 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, if you cannot make that time frame, that's not a problem. You can email me at any time and we'll try and make some arrangements outside of office hours. But know that I will be online somewhere in the 17 Bravo Blackboard Vista website, probably in the chat room area, or looking around to see who's online at the time and bugging you. Our textbooks, Foner, Give Me Liberty, you should already have it. The big one is Pauli Murray, Proud Shoes, The Story of an American Family. A fantastic little book. It's also your book report, so you need to get this book. Let's take a look at some other things, in particular on the syllabus. The goals of the class are, if you were to do math or take a math course, you would definitely be doing math in the class, right? Chemistry, you'd be doing chemistry. In history, you get to do history. But what does that mean? For me, the most important part of that is that you're doing something. It's some sort of action, to participate actively, to go beyond passive reading, memorization, test taking. How boring, how droll. No, no, no. In dictionary form, the verb to do takes several forms: to perform, to execute, to accomplish, to put forth, exert, to be the cause of. So for the next, 15 weeks now, you're going to be the cause of some history creation, which I think is cool. Some of the rules. First, rule number 1, do not fall behind. Do not fall behind is rule number 1. 0 late work accepted. A 0 looks like this. No, you cannot turn work in late. Zero tolerance from this guy. You can turn work in late if you have a doctor's note, or if you're military, your TDY. But outside of that, you will be facing a brick wall in me, and I'll just pass you on to the dean, Mr. Ed Davis, and Mr. Davis will tell you, well, it says right there in the syllabus, why are you turning in work late? Look, there are due dates for a reason, people. Turn it in, otherwise it's a 0. You cannot cite .com websites. No. The reason is scholars do not hang out in .com websites. They hang out in scholarly journals, and those are usually .edu websites. So those are the websites that are acceptable, not .com. .com is lazy. And .coms are also places where people who are not authorities, people who have not dedicated their lives to a particular time frame or a particular abstract or a particular event in history, they have not done that. And so why would you want to take history advice from someone who just might be some 15-year-old kid spouting opinion? That's all I'm saying. You must cite your textbook at least once in every essay. You have 4 essays. You must cite at least one additional secondary document. Trust me, most of you are going to do more than one just because you're cool. And you have to cite at least 2 additional primary documents. Most of you are going to do way more than that. But these are the minimums. Rule 7C, rule number 1, don't fall behind. If you fall behind, you're going to be in trouble. And then, because I don't accept late work, which is rule number 2. Right? Cool. Student learning outcomes. This comes from Yuba College. I do want to point a couple of these things out. History, first of all, is a thinking person's game. Hey, look at that. Student learning outcome number 3, critical thinking. You get to analyze information, and you get to address it and evaluate these problems and issues in making decisions. This is you. Student learning objective number 4, global awareness. The United States was not created in a vacuum. You're going to find that there are events outside of United States control that affect what happens inside the United States. And we're going to have that today, actually, in our lecture. Student learning objective number 5, information competency. You're going to be doing this, and in several forms. You're going to be conducting, presenting, and using research to achieve educational, professional, and personal goals. Hopefully. Yeah, baby. Number 6, personal and social responsibility. We're doing some group stuff, so you're going to interact with others, by being ethical. Okay? About the lectures, which is really cool, and the thing that I really like is that you can stop. I got to really go to the bathroom. Stop. Go. Come back. I'm really hungry. I need a sandwich. Go. Come back. Rewind. If there's something you did not understand, stop, rewind it, watch it again. You can fast forward. Oh, I know this stuff. Right? So this is for you. Cool. You can cite lectures. So you be writing your essay, and according to Joe Kroller lecture and the date, and he said this, and that's why I think I'm right, kind of thing. I like it when you cite not just my lectures, but maybe the lectures of other instructors and professors. Okay. This website, Chicago Manual of Style.org, is a great place to go to learn citations. But it's not free. Well, it is for 30 days, but then after that you got to start paying. About the quiz, you have 3 hours? No, you have been extended to 12. A 12-hour window. So the noon to 3 thing goes away. You now have from 9 in the morning to 9 at night on a Sunday to get your quiz taken care of. Here's the cool part. You get 3 total chances to take it in that 12-hour period, and there are only 15 questions, which is really cool. And quizzes are worth 14% of your grade. There is no reason why you cannot ace every single quiz, or at least get 80% or better. So what I'm telling you is 14% of your grade is going to be an A or a B. Already. Without even thinking. You're welcome. And all the quiz material is on one thing, the Phoner textbook. So you don't have to worry about the Polly Murray book, any secondary additional readings, any primary additional readings, any lectures. None of that's going to be on the quiz. Just what's on the Phoner textbook. You're welcome again. Okay. So let's talk about this dashing young man with the heavy sideburns, Thomas A. Scott. He had a problem. The year was 1872, and he was perplexed. He had some problems. A little bit about Thomas A. Scott first. Thomas A. Scott was the corporate executive officer, otherwise known as the CEO, of the world's largest company. Not just the largest in the United States, it was the largest company in the world at that time, 1872, called the Pennsylvania Railroad. He's the head honcho, he's in charge, and like most CEOs, he's extremely wealthy and he's extremely well connected. So well connected, in fact, that During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, came to Thomas Scott and asked Mr. Scott to be the Assistant Secretary of War, to which he performed most admirably. His job was basically logistics and supply. And in fact, he did such a great job in the Battle of Chattanooga in Tennessee, he managed to move 25,000 Union troops from the Mississippi River all the way to Chattanooga in less than 24 hours. If he had not done that, if he was not personally involved, that battle might have gone to the way of the Confederates. So again, extremely wealthy, extremely well connected politically, and very, very bright. Thomas Scott was the man of the hour in 1872. There was a running gag in the offices and the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Railroad. By the way, the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Railroad were in Pittsburgh, and from the headquarters in Pittsburgh, Tom Scott would sometimes be there, but he would also spend some of his time in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which was the capital and continues to be the capital of the state. And the running gag was, where's Tom Scott? He's in Harrisburg. What's he doing there? He's running the state. You see, Tom Scott would do what a lot of CEOs do today. They would hire attorneys and lawyers to write legislation and then take that legislation to the state assembly, and say, vote on this piece of legislation, please. Of course, Pennsylvania Railroad wrote that legislation, so none of the lawmakers had to write it, but they might read it, or not, and they would vote on it, and 99% of the time it would go, well, not 99%, but a significant portion of it would go by the way, or for the improvement, or it would reflect kindly upon the Pennsylvania Railroad. Not only that, but Tom Scott spent some time in Washington, D.C. People knew who he was. Abraham Lincoln knew who he was. Abraham Lincoln made him Assistant Secretary of War. And he would do the same thing there. He would have lawyers and lawmen write legislation, present it to congressmen and senators, and then it would go on the floor and it would be up for vote. And many, many times the vote would favor the Pennsylvania Railroad. We know this because the Pennsylvania Railroad was one of just a handful of railroads that were allowed to connect into Washington, D.C. itself. So, review, politically connected, very wealthy, extremely smart, and basically running the state, if not the country, for the betterment of his corporation. That's the running gag. But back to his problem. Because in 1872, Thomas Scott had a problem. And part of the problem was with this guy, Collis P. Huntington. You might have heard of him, other than the fact that he has a bad comb-over. He was one of the big four of the Southern Pacific Railroad. He was one of the merchants that mined the miners in Sacramento. He was one of the big four that created, back then, the Central Pacific Railroad, that connected it to the Union Pacific Railroad to create the first transcontinental rail line. Collis P. Huntington, Leyland Stanford, Crocker, and Hopkins, those are the guys. After the transcontinental line was secured, they merged the Southern Pacific and the Central Pacific to become just the Southern Pacific. So thus, Collis P. Huntington was one of four guys who owned the only line that went from the East Coast to the West. What the job of Huntington was to lobby. Sanford stayed back and he lobbied the state of California. Collis P. Huntington went to Washington, D.C. to lobby senators and congressmen, just like Thomas A. Scott. He had in his business model just one main ideal that he wished to hold and to keep true. And we're going to see it and reveal it right now on this map. This is the map of the Texas Pacific Railway, or the proposed Texas Pacific Railway, in the year 1873. Now, I just told you Tom Scott had a problem in 1872. Well, so did, and the same problem existed, by the way, for Collis P. Huntington. And to show you where Huntington's railroad line, I'll just kind of do that. It kind of goes there from St. Louis all the way to Sacramento, the first transcontinental rail line, the only rail line that connected the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. In 1872, both Collis P. Huntington and Thomas A. Scott had a problem. And if you look at the very bottom, in red, or the dark magenta or Merlot stained color, is the completed portion of the Texas and Pacific Railway, and the blue portion was the proposed route. It would connect New Orleans, Louisiana, major busy port, all the way to San Diego, California. San Diego, California had this beautiful harbor. It still does. One of 3 very natural harbors. And besides that, it was a southern route. It wasn't like going over the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were treacherous, especially in the winter. If the Texas and Pacific Railway was successful, it stood to make a tremendous amount of money, which is why Collis P. Huntington and the Big Four built a line going from Sacramento down to Bakersfield, over the Tehachapi Mountains, and heading toward Arizona. So while Texas and Pacific were going to build going west, the Southern Pacific were going to build a rail line through the south going east. Here's the thing about the Texas and Pacific. Guess who was the president of the Texas and Pacific? You're right, Thomas A. Scott. Not only was he CEO of the Pennsylvania Rail Line, but the Texas and Pacific Railway was his baby. And think about it. He's politically connected. He knows everybody in Washington, D.C. He plays politics in the state of Pennsylvania. He's extremely wealthy and very smart. Chances for success seemed, at the outset, pretty high. But he has competition. Competition in Collis P. Huntington and the Southern Pacific Railroad. But both of these men had the same problem, and that was the Crédit Mobilier scandal. Both of them were not involved whatsoever in the Crédit Mobilier. That can be best explained through this gentleman, Oakes Ames, who was a congressman from the state of Massachusetts, who owned shares in Crédit Mobilier. Now, Crédit Mobilier was not a major railroad company. It was a subsidiary company, sort of. If you really want to know about the Crédit Mobilier scandal, I invite you to go to Wikipedia and read about it. Yes, as a historian, I'm telling you to go to Wiki. It's somewhat okay. There's more citations that need to be. Anyway, Collis P. Huntington owned the Central Pacific. They were going to connect with the Union Pacific going one way, except there's one problem. The Union Pacific didn't think that they were going to be successful. And so they used the Union Pacific as a means to make money for themselves, the board members and several top shareholders, by creating a fake company called the Crédit Mobilier, a fake company. a fake company that would charge exorbitant rates for building rail lines, to which they would invoice the Union Pacific, and the Union Pacific would turn around and turn those invoices over to the United States, saying this is how much it costs to build this railroad, please reimburse us. Now, Oaks Ames, as you see here, was part of that scandal. He was given Crédit Mobilier stock at a very low value. And of course, Crédit Mobilier was making so much money because they were charging these exorbitant rates, and on and on. Anyway, if you want to read more about it, please do. This scandal broke wide open during the election of 1871. It broke out during 1872. And why Collis P. Huntington and Thomas A. Scott were having problems was that the United States government turned off the money spigot. No money for you. No money meant that you couldn't build these railroads. The cost of building a railroad is huge. It's not an easy piece of infrastructure. And it's the reason why the United States federal government took it upon themselves to finance or help finance some of the railroad construction, whether it's going east, west, north, or south. Without money, Thomas Scott could not finish building his Texas and Pacific Railroad. Without federal money, Collis P. Huntington could not go beyond Bakersfield to get to Arizona. So what we're going to do is we're going to say goodbye to Oaks Ames for now, because he will be censored, not jailed, by the way. Say goodbye to all that money and say hello to someone who might actually help one of these two gentlemen out. His name is Andrew Carnegie. Now, this is where it gets good. Thomas A. Scott was a principal officer in the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was a supervisor of like the Western Division. When he hired a young boy, age 13, off the streets of Pittsburgh, that young boy had a name, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was, at that time, a telegraph delivery kid, running telegrams all over Pittsburgh, and he frequently came in handing telegrams to Thomas A. Scott, who gave him his first job. Thomas Scott not only hired Andrew Carnegie then became Thomas A. Scott's sort of right-hand man. Thomas A. Scott took Andrew Carnegie under his wing. He protected him. He coddled him. He gave Andrew Carnegie, at the age of 16, insider information about a big purchase that the Pacific Railroad Company was about to make, but hadn't made public yet. He told them that they were going to buy some sleeper cars. Not just a few, but literally thousands of sleeper cars from a particular company called Pullman. If you were smart, Mr. Carnegie, you would mortgage your house, gather up as much money as you can, and buy as much stock in Pullman as you can possibly purchase. Carnegie did this. He managed to gather $256, which in the 1840s was a tremendous amount of money. He turned that money, $256, into $5,000 by the end of the year. What I'm telling you is Thomas A. Scott called Andrew Carnegie my boy Andy. Thomas A. Scott made Andrew Carnegie a millionaire. Thomas A. Scott told Andrew Carnegie which companies to buy and when, which rail line was going where, way ahead before those were publicly known. And of course, wherever a rail line went, we're going there because of this. We found a mine over there and it's producing this nickel or this, this particular ore, invest in that company. It'll take us a few years, but once you get there, that company's stock is going to go through the roof. Andrew Carnegie followed the advice of his mentor, Thomas A. Scott, to a T. Now it's 1872. The largest iron producer in the United States is the company owned by Andrew Carnegie. He owns not just one, not just two, but several iron producing foundries, pumping out more iron than the entire country of Great Britain can produce. And of course, Thomas Scott likes this arrangement because he buys iron from, yes, Andrew Carnegie. See how this works? Well, the story gets more interesting because 1872, the Crédit Mobilier scandal breaks. Huntington cannot get money from the federal government. Thomas Scott cannot get money from the federal government. But there is Carnegie. But Carnegie had just mortgaged about half of his iron foundries to purchase new technology, the Bessemer process, which would create not just iron but steel, and not just steel but the strongest steel in America and perhaps the world. The Bessemer process, but you needed to purchase that infrastructure, and so he mortgaged a tremendous amount of his company. He did not have a lot of money. Well, he did. Thomas Scott decided he would ask Andrew Carnegie for the money to finish out the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Mind you, if that line is completed, it would make money hand over fist. The response from Carnegie is, no, I cannot endanger my own financial position by endorsing a sinking ship. Yes, Thomas A. Scott could not believe the answer he got from Andrew Carnegie, the very gentleman who he made extremely wealthy. Were it not for the actions of Thomas A. Scott, Carnegie would be nothing. Just another immigrant boy roaming around the streets of Pittsburgh. Down below is the citation for all of this, by the way. Thomas A. Scott picks himself up, brushes himself off. But before we go that, unbeknownst to Thomas Scott, who met Andrew Carnegie in October, late October of 1872. Carnegie in New York had met with Collis P. Huntington the month before. Now there's no proof that of what went down at that meeting, but we know that the meeting took place in 1872 between Huntington and Carnegie in 1872, that they both met, and they both met in New York in Carnegie's office in New York City before meeting a month later in Philadelphia between Carnegie and Thomas Scott. What did they talk about? We don't know. What deal did Huntington make with Carnegie a month before Scott arrived? We don't know. We do know Southern Pacific Railroad for the next 15 years bought their steel and their iron only from Carnegie's company. Just saying. Scott picks himself up. Last-ditch effort is to go to Europe. Europe? Why Europe? Europe, yes. Europe, because Europe, at least since the year of 1848, the very year, in 1848, huge protests throughout almost every country and city in Europe: Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, London, Seville. You name a city in Europe in 1848, chances are there were huge protests. The people demanded change in their governments. Revolution was in the air. The people, or the nobility, or the aristocracy, or people with money in Europe were nervous, to say the least. So they began to send their money overseas, to invest in the United States of America, to invest in infrastructure projects in a country that was growing. And even during the Civil War, money from Europe, from Europe's nobility, from the aristocrats of France, Austria, England, all over Europe, sent their money to the United States. If it were not for that particular money, the money of the aristocrats of Europe, building the West or moving west would have been that much more difficult for the United States to do. So here we have a last-ditch effort by Thomas A. Scott to go to some of his European investors who have invested in the past in the Pennsylvania Railroad, and to see if they would buy some bonds for the Texas and Pacific. One of those noble aristocrats was Queen Marie Henrietta, the Queen of Belgium. She agreed to meet with Thomas A. Scott on this particular day, May 9, 1873. If Tom Scott could convince Marie Henriette, Queen of Belgium, to invest in Texas Pacific, he would now have his money, she would have the bonds, and he could go building the empire. He would become even more wealthy than who he was. If that meeting had taken place May 8th, he would have gotten his money. If Thomas Scott had that meeting with the Queen on the morning of May 9th, he would have gotten his money. But the meeting between the Queen and Thomas A. Scott was scheduled at a party that didn't begin until around 7 o'clock in the evening. So the entire day went by, May 9th, and May 9th was also the day that the Wiener Börse collapsed. The Wiener Börse is also known as the Vienna Stock Exchange. And here's one thing that you might want to know. The Queen, Marie Henrietta, was not born a Belgian. She was born in Vienna. She's an Austrian. She married King Leopold. As most monarchs do, they don't recognize borders when it comes to marriage. Most of her money was in the Börse. All through the day of May 9th, 1873, she would get telegram after telegram after telegram telling her how much money she had lost. It was estimated by Scott that he would probably be able to sell to Henrietta, Queen Marie Henrietta, about $2 million worth of bonds, just enough money for him to finish his Texas and Pacific Railroad, perhaps. But in one day, the beginning of the Panic of 1873, the very day Thomas Scott is to get something signed by the Queen, delivering her bonds, and he gets the money, on that very day, the Panic of 1873 starts. One of the greatest and global Great Depressions seen. The Queen's purse went bust, and she informed Thomas Scott that night that she could not indeed, she could no way, purchase those bonds. She didn't have the money. So, here we have them. Look at them. Huntington, Scott, Carnegie. Say goodbye to one of them. By 1878, the Pennsylvania Railroad is bankrupt. Thomas Scott is fired. Thomas Scott collapses. Some think it a stroke. He ends up going to Europe, where he dies just a couple years later, virtually penniless. Say hello to this man, because in 1878 he is perhaps the most influential man in the world. His name is Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer put forth theories following this guy, otherwise known as Charles Darwin. Herbert Spencer followed Charles Darwin's publication on the origin of species in 1859. The whole breadth of Charles Darwin was that species has evolved over time, not just tens of thousands, but tens of millions of years, and that we've had a flowering of different species, but all species have a single origin, according to Charles Darwin. Herbert Spencer read Charles Darwin and loved Charles Darwin's theories on evolution. And Spencer then, in 1864, wrote Principles of Biology, which became much more popular than Darwin's book. Herbert Spencer becomes the man of the late 19th century, not Charles Darwin. Because what Spencer did was that he extended evolutionary theory to society. He extended evolutionary theory to politics. He extended evolutionary theory to business, to economics, to religion, to even ethics. And he concluded that society, politics, business, economics, even religions, even ethics, comes down to a single phrase which Herbert Spencer coined: survival of the fittest. According to Herbert Spencer, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant people are the best. They are the fittest. They have proven themselves evolutionarily superior in society, in politics, in economics, in religion, and indeed ethics. Interesting. Here is a graph from Ngram that shows survival of the fittest and its popularity between the years 1850 and 2008. What's interesting is that, yes, it peaks out at about just before the turn of the century, 1896, 97, somewhere in there, and then turns down a little bit. But just before World War I, it starts to kick up again, probably because of the rise of the Germans, who are also white, who are also Anglo-Saxons, and who are also Protestants, or at least half the country, or more than half the country anyway. But then once World War I is over, we see where the idea of survival of the fittest plummets in popularity, but tends to flatten out in this region that I have highlighted here, from 1929 to about 1945. This represents the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s, and also World War II. And then we see the loss of popularity again on through the 60s, and then over here we see it where it bottoms out, to where it's just 1/3 as popular as it used to be back at the peak in around 1897, 1898. This is around 1988, 90 years later. What's interesting to me, though, is that we see a resurgence in the term of survival of the fittest. A resurgence in the term brought about by Herbert Spencer. And I wonder why. What's happened since 1988 and today? This could be, I think, perhaps theorizing, the success of conservative politics, not just in America, but around the globe. And the idea of survival of the fittest, that we are a more fit society than anybody else, that our economic system is better than anybody else, that our politics, Republican versus Democrats, Republicans are much better, and on and on and on. Conservatives in England went out. Conservatives in Germany won out. Conservatives in France won out. Now, it's interesting that Sarkozy, the conservative in France, just lost an election to a more liberal-minded individual. But the trend has been, as you see this arrow, all around the globe, conservative forces winning back, perhaps from the 1960s and 1970s, the liberal dominance that had been since the end of World War II. Interesting. Well, this leads me to this lasting question as you walk into chapter 16. And the question is simply this. Well, no, it's not a big blue square. The question is this. If Spencer's theories were all the rage in 1872, 1873, and if Andrew Carnegie, Tom Scott, Collis P, Huntington, J.P. Morgan, Cook, Rockefeller, and other robber barons believed that Spencer's theories were all the rage, and indeed practiced it on one another, what hope did labor have against the richest men in America who used their power, political influence, and superior education against the masses? One can only survive, not the other. Survival of the fittest. What hope did labor have in fighting these forces? As you read chapter 16, bear that in mind. What hope did African Americans have in 1873? If Herbert Spencer's theories are wholly and entirely believed by the richest men in America, what hope did Native Americans have? Because in 1873, they're still a fighting force. In fact, in 1876, Indians will defeat Custer at Custer's last stand somewhere in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. The Indians won't surrender until 1893. So we still got 20 years of Indian wars. What hope do Native Americans have if Spencer's theories are all the rage? What hope does anybody have if they are not white, if they are not Anglo-Saxon, and if they are not Protestant? Because once the 1890s arrive, you're going to see immigrants coming from Catholic countries, Italy, or Orthodox countries, Greece, or Russian Orthodox countries, Russia, Eastern and Southern Europeans that do not practice the Protestant religion. Here's some things to keep in mind during all of this. And I want to talk about it, step out of the lecture for a little bit, and talk about how difficult, talk about political science and how difficult it is to change the political culture in our country. And it's because of the Senate and its propensity for avoidance of change. The Senate is on what I call an ABC system, and it works like this. Let's say you have a senator, and you don't like that senator, and that senator is up for election in 1876. Now, a senator serves 6-year terms, so 1876, you're angry at Senator A, and if Senator A wins, you have to wait 6 more years to vote for Senator A again. That would be in 1882, and on and on and on. So these are the election cycles for Senator A, but not all senators in the United States are voted on at the same time. All senators are split up into 3 blocks. So you might have another senator that is making you angry. And by the way, your state only has 2 senators that go to Washington, D.C. And so Senator B makes you angry as well. So 2 years later, in the year 1878, you can vote for Senator B, but you have to wait 2 years. And if Senator B wins his election, just like Senator A did, you have to wait 4 years before you can retain that anger and vote out again, or attempt to vote out against Senator A. Meanwhile, Senator B is still in office for 2 more years. Now add a 3rd cycle on top of this, Senator C, in a neighboring state, to clear out, in other words, to empty out the Senate. From 1876, if people were very, very angry, the masses, they would have to vote in 1876, in 1878, and in 1880 to oust all 3 of those senators. And if any one of those 3 remains, you still have to wait all the way to 1886. This is why it's difficult in the United States for politics to change. It's hard to change the political culture. You can change individuals, but to send a message, well, we're going to clear out the Senate. You can't do that. You have to be angry for at least 10 years. Who holds that grudge for 10 years? Americans have a very short-term memory. We tend to be very forgiving people. Well, we're angry? Well, that was yesterday. Today I'm happy. Give me a cup of coffee. As you, this is the end now, walk into chapter 16, I want you to focus on a few things. Freedom in a corporate world. What did freedom mean to guys like Thomas A. Scott? To Andrew Carnegie? What did they think about freedom? How did they practice freedom? And here's more important, did their freedom impinge upon others? What makes freedom possible in America? What makes freedom possible today? Chapter 16 speaks to this. And industrialism and rails, iron and steel, all that's going on in chapter 16. Also, however, there are extremes in wealth and poverty. It seems that as time went on from the Civil War, that the rich were getting richer and that the poor were getting poorer. And in some sense that seems to be the case today. And we have an election where people are being asked to kind of vote on this. Bear that in mind. Chapter 16 talks about this. There's a guy by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner, and he has a thesis that by the end of 1893, when we finally defeat the Plains Indians, he declared that the frontier of America had been closed. That what had defined Americans since the year 1607, when we settled Virginia, 1620, when we settled in Massachusetts, what had always defined Americans was that we always had a frontier, a place to go west, to redefine ourselves, to get our angst and energy out, to redefine who we were. The frontier identified Americans, and now it was closed. Or was it? Read about the Turner thesis. Read about the defeat of the Plains Indians. Important to me, but I don't have enough time for, are banking and monetary policies. Huge after the Civil War. It's this system that is set up that will define America up until today. Our banking and monetary policies go all the way back to the late 19th century, post-Civil War. We have a group called the Grangers, another group called the ICC, and then there's the Civil Service Act. These are people pushing back against the richest men in America, against corporate farms, corporate mining, against graft and greed. Remember Hurricane Katrina? One of the failures of the federal government was the fact that the person who was in charge of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association or agency, wasn't someone who was of merit. He was a political appointee by the President of the United States. He had no knowledge of emergency matters and what to do in cases of emergency, and it showed. But the Civil Service Act back in the 1870s, 1880s said that such positions should go to people of merit, people who've spent their entire lifetimes studying how to handle emergencies or what other civil service position was going to be open. Was it just a finger in the dike? Or was it something that was a portend of things to come? Also, take a look at social and class divisions in America. They become very disparate. There's a quote by Abram Hewitt on page 615 I want you to take a look at and bring that to heart. And of course, social Darwinism and labor strife. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I have. Thank you very much.